Good morning, folks. Catherine here. It's 11:30 a.m. Sunday, the 3rd of August, 2025, and I'm here to tell a story as it came up in another conversation. So, in the 1990s and early 2000s to mid 2000s, I lived in a rural part of Western Australia, the almost outback, for almost 20 years. It wasn't so far out that you've heard stories of people, if their car breaks down and they haven't got a satellite phone or told the police where they're going, they will die. So it wasn't the true outback in that respect. It was outer farmlands. And for many years there I had no car that was working. So I used to hitchhike up and down the road. I didn't get serial killered once. I only met one actual creep in that time. And most of the people that were going up and down the road were local farmers or service for the local farmers, rural supplies agents and that kind of thing. And I did actually, just by chance, catch a ride with the local politician 3 times. And in that rural area, he was actually the deputy premier, the assistant to the next to the state premier, because he lived in that area and he was the MP for that whole rural area. So, one time I'm hitchhiking into the nearest city, and I walk out down the side road to the nearest sort of sub-main road, wait there, put my thumb out when a car comes along, and in the daylight, most days, there's about 4 vehicles an hour. Sometimes the first vehicle will pick you up, sometimes you wait 3 hours, and the 12th or so vehicle will stop and pick you up. So a car stops, picks me up. There's an old lady driving, mature age lady, old lady. And we get to chatting, because it's 2 to 3 hours to get into the city. And I first noticed the car. It was an automatic transmission. And she was saying, well, she was a widow and her husband had died a few years ago and she'd had to learn to drive. So having to learn to drive as a 60 or 70-year-old, she automatic was easier. Yeah. She had a slight German-type accent. And so discussion covered that. And yes, her and her husband had moved out from Austria after World War II. Obviously in Europe there was a lot of destruction. That's partly why my mum and dad came out from England in at the end of in the years after World War II. There was still a lot of destruction throughout Britain and Europe, and so I mentioned about did you have any children, whatever, and she was actually driving through. I can't remember why she was driving through West Australia at the time. She was actually based mostly in Victoria, which is literally 1,000+ miles away. But anyway, she'd been based, I think, in Victoria. Now, they'd had a couple of kids since coming to Australia. I'm not sure if the kids were born there. Yes, they were. The kids were born in Australia. They'd had a couple of children while they'd been in Australia, a boy and a girl. And I mentioned, we were talking about languages and learning languages. And I said, well, did your children learn German? And she said, yes. She said, my husband and I were trying to learn English, as they'd just arrived in Australia in the late 40s or early 50s. But it's a process that takes many years. The children obviously grew up speaking perfect Australian accented English, because that's what they had right from neighbourhood school friends, preschool, school years, etc. But the parents still spoke in German at times, and the children learnt that, just like you learn it from your mum and your dad. And I said, have they ever gone back to Austria to see distant relatives, cousins, grandma, granddad, whatever. And she said, yes, they both had on different occasions. They'd both gone back. And she told me of one incident where her son had gone back for an extended break to Austria, and he'd been driving around, got a rental car so he could drive around, and he stopped at some store, at a shop somewhere, got lost. This probably before GPS was very common, so got lost, stopped at a store to ask directions, and the people at the store looked at him funny and sort of, yeah, like, well, you know, that's just up the road. And get that cough out. Why are you asking us? You bloody live around here, kind of thing, in German, obviously. And he says, oh, you know, I'm sorry, I don't know the area well, I'm visiting, I've come from Australia. And they were replying back to him, in German, obviously, no, you're a local, you live locally. And she said, in the end, he had to take out his Australian passport and show it for them to believe that he'd come from Australia. Because, of course, what's happening? It wasn't just that he spoke German perfectly well, that it was the Austrian dialect of German well, or like a native, but he spoke that little province's dialect of Austrian German, which is, of course, what his mum and dad spoke. So even they were in Australia, when he was a little child, hearing mum and dad speak that particular localised dialect of Austrian German. So that's why, even, you know, when he was a young man and he'd finished university and he went off to Austria for a big OE, an overseas expedition, and I thought that was quite a good and quite a little funny story. So yeah, both of her children learned German, not just well enough to get by on the times they visited Austria, but that her son was mistaken for a local and they thought he was playing a joke on them when he asked for directions, because he spoke with the actual local provincial sub-dialect, I guess, of Austrian German. And the lesson there, people who are parents, is that if you've come from another language area, teach your kids your original language. You know, if it's German and you've gone and lived in Australia, teach your kids German. Vietnamese, Chinese, whatever. Teach your kids your family tree language. And if you teach them at a young age, they will learn to speak it without a foreign accent. And they'll pick it up easily when they're little. There's various research about learning languages before kids get to the age of 3 or 6 or 9 or 10 or 15, and you know exactly where you sort of draw the line. But kids of 3 years old can be bilingual, kids of 6 years old can be trilingual with no trouble at all. So, and can learn it to a good standard. Okay, folks, that's all. A little bit of a funny story and a pleasant story. So, that was all. Okay, bye. Got to get up to turn the camera off.